He bought an old engine for next to nothing, but when he took it apart, he realized that inside was something worth killing for. See what his discovery turned out to be. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the street outside Edgar Milton's workshop slick and shining under the dim yellow light of the street lamp. The world beyond that light had the exhausted stillness of places that people had given up on long ago. The air carried the mixed scents of rust, oil, and the faint sweetness of burned rubber. On the cracked asphalt, puddles reflected the sagging metal roof of Milton Motors, the only garage left in this part of the industrial district. Inside, the rhythmic click of cooling metal filled the silence after a long night of work. Edgar wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag and leaned back from the hood of an old delivery van that hadn't moved in weeks. He'd been promising the owner it would be ready for months, but parts cost more than customers could pay, and most people who drove vehicles like this didn't have money to spare. At 46, Edgar had spent more years fixing engines than he cared to count, yet now he often caught himself wondering whether there was any point in keeping the shop open at all. The bills came faster than customers, and the rent climbed higher every year. He looked around the garage, the dented toolboxes, the faded 2012 calendar, the cracked coffee mug on the bench. Everything here felt frozen in time, including him. His ex-wife used to say he was married to engines, not to her. Maybe she was right. She'd left with their son 9 years ago, heading west to start over. He hadn't seen either of them since. He sometimes thought of calling, but each time the phone in his hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds. What would he say anyway? I'm still here, fixing junk no one wants? He dropped the idea every time. The day had stretched into night, and now the tired glow from a single hanging bulb gave the workshop an amber haze. Edgar was gathering his tools when headlights spilled across the far wall. He froze, rag still in his hand. It was nearly midnight. No one came here this late. The sound of a diesel engine idling outside grew louder. Then came 3 sharp honks. He walked to the door, unlatched it, and peered out. A battered white pickup sat in the drizzle, its paint dulled by years of hard work. 3 men stepped out, their faces half hidden beneath hooded jackets. They moved quickly, efficiently, not like customers. The tallest one spoke first. You the mechanic? Edgar nodded slowly. That's what the sign says. The man jerked a thumb toward the truck bed. Got a V8 Scania engine. Need to get rid of it. Cheap. Scania? Edgar repeated, frowning. Those things don't come cheap. Where'd you get it? The man smiled thinly. Does it matter? The second man climbed onto the tailgate and pulled back the tarp. The sight of the engine made Edgar's breath hitch. It was massive, immaculate, the kind of machinery designed for heavy transport or specialized equipment. It gleamed even under the weak streetlight, but the edges of the bolts were clean, too clean. The serial plate looked freshly sanded. How much? Edgar asked, despite himself. $3,000, the first man said. Take it or leave it. It was ridiculous. Even a damaged Scania engine would fetch 20 times that. Edgar's instincts screamed at him to shut the door and walk away. Something about these men, their stillness, the way their eyes roamed the shadows behind him, set his nerves on edge. Yet behind that unease was a whisper of desperation. His rent was overdue, and the power company had already sent a warning letter. If he flipped this engine, he could clear his debts and maybe have a few months of peace. He tried to stall. You got paperwork? The tall man laughed once, low and sharp. It's all yours, old man. You won't find a better deal anywhere. The third man, silent until now, leaned closer. His voice was flat, almost amused. Just don't look too deep inside. Some things aren't worth finding. The words landed like a cold hand on the back of Edgar's neck, but greed, or maybe hope, was stronger than fear. He nodded, handed over the crumpled bills he'd been saving for taxes, and watched as the men unloaded the engine onto his floor. They didn't ask for a receipt, didn't shake his hand. Within minutes, the pickup's taillights vanished into the mist, leaving only silence and the hulking presence of the machine. Edgar locked the door and stood looking at it. The Scania dominated the room, its metallic sheen reflecting the yellow bulb like the eye of something alive. He ran his fingers along the smooth casing. Cold. Perfect. He had rebuilt hundreds of engines, but never one like this. It had no scratches, no rust, not even fingerprints. The bolts had been sealed recently, as though someone wanted to keep something inside. He should have gone home, but he couldn't make himself leave. Instead, he brewed a cup of instant coffee and sat beside the engine, staring. Rain tapped lightly on the roof. The shop smelled of oil, steel, and damp air. Outside, a train passed somewhere far away, its whistle stretching through the dark like a warning. When the coffee cooled, he noticed the silence. No creaks, no distant hum, just a suffocating stillness. He turned off the light, leaving only the faint glow from the window. That was when he saw it, a faint smear of mud near the door, shaped like the tread of a heavy boot. He bent down and touched it. Still wet. The realization made his chest tighten. Someone had come inside while he was distracted. He checked the locks, nothing broken. The air felt colder now, heavier. He told himself it was nothing, just nerves. Yet as he moved to the small cot in the corner, he couldn't shake the feeling that the engine wasn't just sitting there. It was waiting. He lay down, shoes still on, eyes fixed on the silhouette of the machine. The metal caught bits of moonlight through the grimy window, throwing faint glints across the walls. He could almost imagine it breathing. His mind replayed the stranger's words. Don't look too deep inside. Somewhere outside, a vehicle slowed. He heard tires crunch gravel, then idle for a few seconds before driving away. He held his breath, counting the beats in his chest, until the sound faded completely. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. He rolled over, shut his eyes, and tried to laugh at himself. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe tomorrow he'd wake up, check the engine, and realize it was nothing more than a lucky break. He'd clean it, list it for sale, and finally get ahead for once. But as the minutes crawled by, his thoughts refused to quiet. Every so often, he imagined hearing a low hum, a vibration in the floor, as if the engine's heart were pulsing faintly. When he got up to touch it, the surface was icy. He went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn began to gray the windows. The next morning, he found another boot print outside the door fresh pressed into the wet dirt by the gate. He stood for a long time looking at it, then glanced toward the street. A white van was parked across from the workshop, engine running. The windows were dark. When he stepped toward it, the van rolled away slowly, turning the corner without signaling. By noon, he'd convinced himself it didn't mean anything. He worked mechanically, changing oil in an old Chevy, tightening bolts on a radiator. But the presence of that engine loomed behind him like a secret whispering through the walls. When evening came again, he sat by the workbench and stared at the Scania. He felt torn between two impulses, the cautious voice that told him to call the police, and the other voice, sharper and hungrier, that said this might be his one chance to change everything. He turned off the radio, and in the silence, the rain began again, slow and steady. He walked toward the door, checked the locks one last time, and looked back at the gleaming shape in the shadows. The light caught on one edge, glimmering faintly, as if the metal itself were reflecting a heartbeat. Edgar switched off the lamp. The room fell into darkness. Somewhere beneath the steady rhythm of the rain, he thought he heard the faintest echo, a metallic click, like a breath drawn inside steel. And for the first time in years, Edgar Milton felt afraid of something he couldn't name. The next morning arrived without sunlight. Gray clouds hung low, heavy with mist, and the workshop smelled of damp steel and burnt oil. Edgar stood beside the engine, his reflection faintly mirrored in the polished metal, his hands motionless at his sides. He hadn't really slept. Every sound during the night had felt like a warning, the wind rattling a loose sheet of tin, the drip of rain from the gutter, the groan of the wooden door frame. The Scania stood silent, glistening slightly under the flickering light bulb, and yet it seemed to occupy the room like a presence rather than an object. He had dreamed of it, or maybe he hadn't really stopped thinking about it long enough to dream. Either way, the sense that something inside it didn't belong kept gnawing at him. He brewed coffee and drank it black, staring at the machine. The sensible part of him said to stop, to call someone, to let the police deal with it. But that same sensible voice had never paid the bills. Reason hadn't kept his marriage together or stopped the eviction notice last year. Survival did not belong to the careful. It belonged to the ones who acted before doubt could drag them down. He convinced himself that looking inside wasn't a crime. Curiosity, he told himself, was just part of the job. He started to work. The day passed in a slow rhythm of metallic sounds, the click of sockets, the soft hiss of the air compressor, the scrape of metal on metal. Every time he removed a panel, he expected to find something, maybe drugs, maybe weapons. But all he saw was immaculate machinery. Whoever had handled this engine last had cleaned it with the precision of a surgeon. The bolts gleamed, and the interior chambers were spotless. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that the perfection itself was suspicious. When he reached the cooling block, he noticed something odd. A smear of dark gray sealant lined one of the joints, fresher than the rest. He brushed his thumb across it. It flaked slightly. Someone had resealed this recently, maybe days ago. He leaned closer, shining his flashlight inside the narrow space, and there, wedged between two pipes, he saw a tiny lump wrapped in fabric. He froze. The cloth looked old, but it didn't belong there. With slow, deliberate motions, he loosened the clamps and reached in with a pair of tweezers, pulling out the small bundle. It was a pouch, maybe the size of his palm, tied with a strip of leather. The fabric was coarse, like canvas, and faintly stained. He hesitated for several seconds before untying it. Inside, 2 gold rings and a handful of small, translucent stones rolled into his palm. They caught the light and scattered it across the walls like cold fire. The rings were heavy, older than anything modern, engraved with symbols he couldn't read. One bore a coat of arms, a shield with a rearing animal, and the other, smaller and more delicate, had a thin line of Latin carved inside. Sin culpa, without guilt. Edgar's pulse quickened. He turned the stones between his fingers. They weren't glass. They had that sharp, unyielding hardness of real gems, though something about their clarity felt unnatural, almost sterile. He closed his hand around them, the cold seeping into his skin. For a moment, the room seemed to close in around him. The air thickened. He looked toward the door, half expecting someone to be standing there watching him. But there was nothing. Only the hum of the fluorescent light and the faint tick of the wall clock. He wrapped the pouch back up and hid it in the bottom drawer of his tool cabinet. Then he stood there, staring at the drawer as though it might start to move on its own. What was he supposed to do now? Call the police and explain he'd bought a stolen engine for cash from 3 strangers? They'd arrest him before he could finish his story. And if he said nothing? That thought was worse. Whoever the engine belonged to would come looking eventually. The men who'd sold it hadn't seemed like amateurs. By the time dusk settled again, the workshop had grown darker than usual. He switched on the radio, hoping for the distraction of talk or music, but the static hissed before a calm announcer's voice filled the space. Authorities continue their investigation into last week's theft at the Ryan Industrial Facility, the voice said. Sources claim several high-value items, including precision laser components and synthetic crystalline materials, were stolen. Investigators have reason to believe. Edgar turned it off. He stood still, gripping the edge of his workbench. Synthetic crystalline materials. The phrase burned in his mind. He looked down at his hands, remembering the impossible clarity of those stones. They hadn't been diamonds, not in the natural sense. They'd been something else engineered, manufactured, and now missing from a restricted government facility. His stomach turned. That night he dreamed of engines opening like mouths, of metal that swallowed light, of faceless men digging through his drawers. He woke before dawn to the sound of footsteps outside the shop. He sat up, listening. 1, 2, 3 steps. Then silence. When he finally gathered the nerve to look, there was no one. But in the morning, he found a scrap of paper slipped beneath the door. It was blank, except for a single fingerprint smudge in the corner, greasy and dark. By noon, paranoia had turned into something heavier, like gravity pressing down on his chest. He smoked one cigarette after another, watching the road from the narrow window. Across the street, a van idled for almost an hour. White, no logos, no plates. When he finally stepped outside to get a closer look, it pulled away smoothly, without hurry, disappearing into the fog. He told himself it was a coincidence, but his gut disagreed. He worked the rest of the day half distracted, fumbling with tools, starting and stopping tasks. Every few minutes his gaze returned to the cabinet drawer. The pouch was still there. He could almost hear it breathing, whispering from the shadows, like a buried conscience. He thought about throwing it away, tossing it into the river, or leaving it in a dumpster far from here. But what if someone had hidden it in that engine for a reason? What if it wasn't just contraband, but evidence of something darker? As the hours passed, his exhaustion deepened. When night came again, he locked the doors, bolted the windows, and sat on his cot with a bottle of whiskey. The drink burned his throat, but the warmth helped slow the panic pulsing in his head. He remembered the years in the orphanage gray walls, the smell of bleach, the strict matron who used to tell the boys that no one would ever come back for them. Back then, he'd learned that survival depended on silence. Keep your head down. Don't get caught in someone else's mess. But that lesson hadn't saved him from loneliness. And now, the silence he'd mastered his whole life was starting to suffocate him. He took the pouch out again, unwrapped one of the rings, and turned it over in the dim light. The engraving glinted. Sin culpa. Without guilt. He whispered the words out loud and laughed bitterly. Without guilt, he muttered. What a joke. The truth was, guilt had been the only constant in his life. For his son growing up without him, for his ex-wife leaving with nothing but a suitcase, for every choice he'd made to look away instead of doing the right thing. Maybe that was why he couldn't throw the pouch away. It was the first secret that made him feel alive again, the first thing that didn't belong to anyone else's rules. In the early hours of morning, someone knocked on the metal door. Not hard. 3 short taps, deliberate. Edgar froze. He waited. The knocks came again, softer. When he finally went to check, the street was empty. A single chalk mark had been drawn on the door, 3 intersecting lines forming a rough triangle. He stared at it until dawn broke over the rooftops, painting the mark pale pink before it faded with the rain. He didn't open the shop that day. Instead, he drove to the other side of town to see someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Marcus, the jeweler. They'd known each other since their 20s, back when both still believed skill was enough to build a future. Marcus had once worked for a government contractor, designing prototypes of laser lenses before an accident cost him his position. If anyone could tell him what those stones were, it was Marcus. The jewelry shop was small and dimly lit, smelling of polish and dust. Marcus looked up from his bench when Edgar entered, his lined face creasing into surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Didn't think you'd ever crawl out from that garage." Edgar tried to smile, but couldn't. He placed the pouch on the counter. "Need you to tell me what these are." Marcus untied it, poured the contents onto a velvet pad, and for a few moments said nothing. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed in fear. He touched one of the stones with the tip of a metal pick, then another. "Where did you get these?" Edgar didn't answer. Marcus exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't have them. These aren't jewels. They're synthetic diamonds, military grade, laser-grade optics, the kind that never leave the lab." Edgar's throat tightened. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Marcus said quietly. "And if you're smart, you'll get rid of them now. People don't steal things like this unless they're desperate or dangerous. Either way, you don't want to be in the middle." The rest of the conversation blurred. Edgar left the shop in silence, the pouch heavy in his pocket, Marcus's warning echoing in his ears. Outside, the sky had darkened again. The city felt different, emptier, like a stage after the actors had gone. He turned down a side street and realized someone was following him, a black sedan, headlights off, keeping its distance. By the time he reached the garage, his hands were trembling. He locked the doors and shut off every light. For hours he sat there in the dark, listening for movement. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear. When he finally dozed off, he dreamed of flames of engines melting into pools of silver, of a child's voice whispering without guilt over and over until it became the sound of rain. When he woke, morning light was breaking through the grime on the windows. The air smelled of smoke, though nothing burned. He walked over to the workbench and opened the drawer. The pouch was still there, untouched. He stared at it for a long time before closing the drawer again. Outside, a car door slammed. He looked out the window but saw nothing. The road was empty. The wind carried a low hum that might have been the sound of tires far away, or something else entirely. He turned back to the engine. The gleam of the metal seemed duller now, as though it knew its secret was out. He thought of Marcus's warning, of the chalk mark, of the van. The pieces fit together too neatly to be coincidence. Someone was looking for what he had found. He sat down beside the machine, lit another cigarette, and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. His mind drifted to the orphanage again, to the day he'd stolen a chocolate bar and been caught. The headmaster hadn't shouted. He'd just looked at him and said, "You'll always take what isn't yours, Milton. It's who you are." Now, decades later, that prophecy seemed to hang over him like a curse. But something inside him rebelled. Maybe for once, he could do something right, even if no one ever knew. He put out the cigarette and looked around the workshop. The drawers, the shelves, the walls, all suddenly seemed fragile, temporary, as if they were already fading into memory. He knew he couldn't keep the pouch here forever. The only question was what kind of man he wanted to be when someone finally came to collect it. Night fell again before he realized how much time had passed. The radio sat silent. The bulb above the bench burned out, and the Scania stood in shadow, its surface cold as stone. Outside, the rain returned, tapping lightly against the door. Edgar lay on the cot, eyes open, waiting for sleep that never came, his mind circling the same thought until dawn. Without guilt. The words no longer sounded like absolution. They felt like a warning. The third morning broke cold and brittle, with a pale strip of sunlight struggling through the misted windows of the workshop. Edgar hadn't slept again. He sat at the small table near the door, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The smell of metal, oil, and smoke hung heavy in the air, clinging to everything. He stared at the Scania engine in the corner, its silent bulk looming like an unanswered question. The pouch lay on the table beside him. He had taken it out again during the night, unable to keep it hidden any longer. Every time he touched it, a current of unease ran through him, as if the fabric still carried the pulse of the men who had sealed it inside that machine. The previous night's silence had been the worst yet. He had sat awake, listening to the soft creaks of the building, each one stretching like the pause before a storm. He was certain he had heard footsteps outside around midnight. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. They had stopped by the door, and then faded away. He hadn't dared to look. He knew they would come sooner or later, and somehow he was no longer sure whether he wanted to run or to face them. Something inside him, something old and tired, had decided that he was finished running from his life. He opened the pouch and looked again at the contents. The stones glinted in the light like fragments of frozen stars, impossibly clear, impossibly sharp. The two rings caught his attention, the heavy one with the crest and the delicate one engraved with Sin Culpa. He rolled the smaller ring between his fingers, tracing the letters, whispering the words like a confession. Without guilt. The irony of it made him smile for the first time in days, though it wasn't a happy smile. He had lived his whole life with guilt carved into his bones. Guilt for his son, for the marriage he'd destroyed, for every decision made out of fear. But this strange thing he'd found, the danger that came with it, had given him something like purpose. He stood and began pacing the workshop. The sound of his boots on the concrete floor echoed faintly, mingling with the ticking of the clock. Each second sounded like a countdown. He thought of Marcus, the jeweler, and his pale, frightened face. "You shouldn't have them," Marcus had said. "Get rid of them." Edgar understood now that it wasn't just a warning. It was mercy. He imagined what might happen to Marcus if those men realized he had seen the stones. The thought settled like a weight in his chest. He had dragged an old friend into something dangerous simply by showing up. By noon, he had made his decision. He would sell the stones, but not to keep the money, not to save himself. He would take that cursed wealth and give it away to a place untouched by greed, by the hunger that had ruined his own life. There was only one place he could think of that fit that description. The orphanage where he had grown up. The children there had nothing, just as he'd had nothing, and maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to balance the scales, even if no one would ever know. He knew a man, someone he'd once repaired engines for years ago, who handled trades no one spoke about openly. His name was Tony, and he worked out of a storage yard near the docks. Tony wasn't a friend, but he was reliable, and more importantly, discreet. Edgar called him from the payphone near the gas station down the road. His voice came through the static with the same half-laughing tone Edgar remembered. "Milton, you old bastard. You're still alive." "Need to move something," Edgar said quietly. "Fast." There was a pause. "How fast?" "Tonight." Tony hesitated. "You're not in trouble, are you?" Edgar let the silence answer for him. By the time he hung up, the decision was irreversible. He went back to the workshop, cleaned the pouch, and wrapped it in an old cloth. As the sun began to fade, he loaded it into his jacket pocket and drove the rusted pickup toward the docks. The city around him felt deserted, its gray streets washed in orange light. He thought of how many years he had spent moving through these same roads, invisible to everyone, fixing their machines, patching up what they broke. Maybe this was what redemption looked like. Not freedom, but the choice to do one thing that mattered. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the harbor. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of salt and iron. Tony was already there, leaning against a crate, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. His eyes flicked toward the pouch when Edgar stepped into the light. "Let me see," he said. Edgar handed it over without a word. Tony opened it carefully, the stones catching the dull light like something alive. He whistled under his breath. "Jesus, you don't mess around, do you?" "I don't want to know what you'll do with them," Edgar said. "I just need cash, enough to make it disappear." Tony studied him for a moment. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure." Tony nodded, zipped the pouch back up, and reached into his coat. He handed Edgar an envelope, thick with bills. "You didn't get this from me, and you never saw me." Edgar took it and left without looking back. Outside, the wind off the harbor carried the scent of diesel and seawater. The lights of the ships shimmered across the dark water like distant fires. He stood there for a long moment, breathing it all in, then walked toward his truck. The drive to the orphanage took 2 hours. The old building stood on the edge of town, the same cracked walls and iron gates he remembered from his childhood. The paint was peeling, but the lights were on. Through the fence he could see a few children playing in the yard, bundled in coats against the cold. The sight hit him harder than he expected. For a moment he saw himself there again, a skinny boy with grease on his hands, watching cars go by on the highway beyond the trees, dreaming of escape. He parked a block away and walked back, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Near the gate, a wooden donation box sat half-covered by fallen leaves. He looked around. No one was watching. He slipped the envelope inside, hesitated, then added a folded note he had written on the drive over. It said only, "For the ones who still believe in fixing what's broken." Then, after a pause, he added one more line. "Without guilt." As he turned to leave, a gust of wind scattered the leaves around his feet, carrying the faint sound of children's laughter. For the first time in many years, he felt a kind of peace, a quietness that came not from hiding, but from having nothing left to hide. The feeling didn't last. When he pulled up to the workshop again, it was late evening. The street was empty, yet the air carried a strange stillness, the kind that precedes a storm or an arrival. His headlights swept across the building, and in that brief flash, he saw them 2 figures standing near the entrance, motionless, their faces lost in shadow. A black SUV was parked by the curb. He turned off the engine and sat there, the silence pressing against the windows. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. He knew this was the end of it. Whether they were thieves, agents, or something worse, they were here for what he'd taken, and they wouldn't leave without him. He stepped out slowly, feeling the night air bite his skin. The men didn't move. He could sense their eyes on him as he walked past them toward the door. He unlocked it, went inside, and closed it behind him. The smell of gasoline greeted him immediately. For a moment he didn't understand. Then he saw the canisters. They hadn't been there before. 2 of them, open, tipped on their sides, the floor already slick with fuel. He realized what they meant to do. It wasn't just retrieval, it was erasure. He looked around the workshop, his tools, his workbench, the photos pinned to the wall, the old calendar that had hung there for more than a decade. Everything he had been was inside these walls. He felt no anger, only clarity. They could take his life, but they wouldn't take the last good thing he'd done. The money was gone, already in the hands of those who needed it. That was enough. He picked up the phone and dialed Marcus's number. When his friend answered, Edgar's voice was calm. "If I don't call you again," he said, "just know I finally did something right." Marcus's voice trembled on the other end. "Edgar, what are you talking about? Where are you?" But Edgar had already hung up. He set the phone down, lit a match, and watched the flame dance between his fingers. The reflection of it shimmered on the surface of the Scania's metal casing, and for an instant, it almost looked as if the engine were alive again, breathing, remembering. He dropped the match. The explosion came minutes later, shaking the windows of nearby buildings. The fire consumed everything: the engine, the walls, the roof, and whatever remained of the man who had once lived inside them. When the firefighters arrived, there was nothing to save. The blaze had burned too hot, too fast. All they found among the ashes was a twisted wrench with the initials EM carved faintly into its handle. 2 days later, the story ran in a small corner of the local paper. Accidental fire at old mechanic's shop, one presumed dead. No one mentioned the Scania engine or the theft from the Ryan facility. The case, like so many others, was quietly forgotten. But miles away, in the orphanage on the edge of town, the headmistress opened the donation box to find an envelope stuffed with bills. No note, no name, just the faint smell of oil on the paper. With the money, they repaired the leaking roof, installed a new furnace, and bought supplies for the winter. A small plaque was later placed in the hall, engraved with simple words, "From someone who once believed nothing could be fixed." In the weeks that followed, rumors spread. Some said a man had been seen hitchhiking west along the highway, his clothes singed, a silver ring on his finger. Others claimed the body in the fire hadn't been him at all. But the truth, like the smoke that had risen over that lonely street, drifted upward and vanished. And somewhere, far beyond the city's lights, a truck moved down an empty road, its engine humming softly in the dark. Behind the wheel sat a man with tired eyes and scarred hands. On the passenger seat lay a single ring, engraved with the words, "Sine culpa." He drove without destination, without fear, and, at last, without guilt. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel, and share this one with someone who loves a good mystery.